All right, so welcome to the Sociotechnical Cybersecurity Speaker Series. This is our second in what we hope will be a long line of talks. And I'm going to let Ido Sevilla introduce our speaker today. Go take it away.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we are so happy and delighted to have Jenny June with us. So who is Jenny? Jenny is a research fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology and a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. She also serves as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. Her current research explores the dynamics of how coercion works in cyberspace, so we're going to hear about that. Her broader interests include cyber conflict, North Korea, and security issues in East Asia. Jenny is a co-author of the 2015 Center for Strategic and International Studies report, North Korea's Cyber Operations, Strategy and Responses, published by Roman and Littlefield. She has presented her work on North Korea's cyber operations at various panels and has provided multiple government briefings and media interviews on the topic. She received her MA and BS each from the Security Studies program and the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Jenny, we are so happy to have you today. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Ido, for the introduction, and thanks to the iSchool for having me. I do have to, full disclosure, I'm coming from a social science discipline, especially in political science, and so some of my approaches or how I structure my research may be, not common or from the perspective of your discipline, but please bear that in mind, that if you have any questions along the way of terms I'm throwing at you that are very political sciencey, but not, well recognized in your discipline, please feel free to let me know. But otherwise, I'd be happy to take substantive questions at the end, unless you have any clarifying questions. Great, so I'm excited to share some of my research on coercion in cyberspace, especially focusing on the dynamics of ransomware today. So before I begin, I just want to give you a little bit of context as to how today's presentation fits into my broader research program. So my current research is a series of works exploring the dynamics of how cyber capabilities can or cannot be used to coerce adversaries, whether they're state actors or non-state actors. And here my goal is to really disaggregate the term cyber operation, at least from the perspective of the international relations literature, as much as possible. So just like how we think about cruise missiles and ballistic missiles as fundamentally distinct sort of machines and their sort of strategic implications completely different, or a submarine versus a career strike group, like the same thing should be applied to cyber operations. Cyber operation is really a catch-all term that encompasses really a really wide variety of behaviors, but also functions. And so, we shouldn't be lumping in DDoS, espionage, ransomware, all of these things together into one bucket. And so my goal is to disaggregate these sort of functions and behaviors as much as possible in our discipline, so that we get a more nuanced sense of what cyber operations means for international relations and so forth. So I want to separate, how the dynamics of ransomware works, how the dynamics of hack and leak operations work, and what's the coercive dynamics of things like wipers. And I want to think about them all as separate entities rather than one. And this core research area is linked to a range of other topics I'm exploring that are beyond cyber coercion. So I'm also interested in how signaling works in cyberspace. And signaling in our discipline means, how do we differentiate one type of actor from another type of actor based on certain observations of their behaviors or speeches that act as signals of their type. And so how do we think about that? How do we use actions and behaviors in cyberspace to think about types? Second of all, I want to think a little bit about, okay, so if I can coerce another actor and if they can coerce me, when do we get sort of a mutual hostage relationship and therefore use that as a basis for getting some sort of mutual restraint? And under what conditions does that arrangement fail? And finally, because of my previous work on North Korea, I'm also interested in how small powers, especially powers that don't have great conventional capabilities, are likely to leverage cyber capabilities for various geopolitical gains. Okay, so I will present my work on ransomware in mainly 3 chunks. So first, walking you through the theory on cyber coercion from the IR literature, and then presenting an overview of my formal model. And it's always hard to present formal models in a very short presentation, so I'm just going to mainly walk you through the intuitions of them mostly, but also, try to walk you through some of the setup at least. And then finally spend some time on discussing the implications of my research for IR theory, but also policy, and we can also talk about ransomware policy towards the end. All right, so let's dive straight into today's topic. So a central problem in getting someone to make concessions by threatening to inflict harm on them is a need to convince them that this threat is quite real before actually going through with the actual harm. And an important component of this convincing process is revealing that the threatener indeed has some sort of capability with which to carry out the harm. So I have a big stick, and therefore I can use this big stick to hit you several times on the head. Usually this isn't much of a strategic problem, right? So if you have a big army, just simply put on an annual massive military parade. If you have ICBMs, do some testing, and there's not much sort of stopping the high type. When I mean high type, the capable type, from brandishing its big weapon, and that doesn't come with all these side effects. In more recent years, however, scholars, in our discipline at least, have begun to pay more attention to special subsets of capabilities in which the revelation of specific information about the capabilities also easily undermines the effectiveness of that capability by allowing the defender to take quick and effective countermeasures. And so if you see the submarine example over here, so a new set of scholars have begun to focus on capabilities like these, where coming up with countermeasures is relatively easier than coming up with the equally large army to counter the conventional military. And so definitely the problem is not unique to cyber, but the prevailing argument is that it is especially severe in cyber. And this is a series of works by Eric Artsky and John Lindsay. And so Eric Artsky and John Lindsay call this the cyber commitment problem. And this is a prominent theory, at least in IR, in which they argue that coercion using cyber capabilities will be difficult due to an inherent trade-off between mainly 2 things. So one is the need to demonstrate capability to let the victim know that the threat is real. I have enough of a sophisticated cyber army, and I can unleash some wiper malware on your systems whenever I want. And then there is some sort of need to convey that I have that capability. Versus there is a second need to maintain basically a covert presence throughout the campaign, initial access, gain privilege within the target's network, maintain persistence, all of that until the final destructive payload is dropped. And usually, if you're compromised at this preparatory stage, there's a higher chance that your access will be blocked and you won't be able to have that final destructive effect that you intended. And so because these 2 trade-offs are very severe, at least the theory of the cyber commitment problem says, this is going to make coercion in cyberspace very difficult to do. You cannot reveal your capabilities but stay hidden at the same time. And so my argument is that although there are situations where this cyber commitment problem certainly does exist, and I do explore variation within the cyber commitment problem in a separate paper, there are also plenty of other coercive situations in cyberspace in which this problem is either not very severe or even non-existent. And so there are important exceptions to this theory that we see in the wild, special example being ransomware, that renders this cyber commitment problem not really applicable to those subsets of cyberspace. And yes, they come with their strategic dilemmas of their own. These special sets of phenomenon in cyberspace in which this commitment problem doesn't exist. It's just, and these other strategic dilemmas complicate successful coercion in their own little ways. It's just not because of the cyber commitment problem. Right, and as I said, one prominent subset of cyber operations in which this problem does, not exist is ransomware. And with this group of people, I don't have to probably go through what ransomware is, but usually I have to. Right? So ransomware is a type of malware that uses encryption to lock victims' data and its related systems and asks for a ransom payment in exchange for a decryption key. So it's similar to hostage taking in cyberspace. And I also just want to clarify that although ransomware attacks in practice has evolved to be, really a combination of different behaviors. For example, like the primary function is forced encryption, but these days it will also steal data in a double extortion scheme to then use as blackmail or to keep victims from going to law enforcement and things like that. And sometimes they're also used as de facto wipers if you never provide a decryption key. Kind of spreads like NotPetya. And so I'm only referring to the original and core function of ransomware today, which is basically taking hostage of victims' data during encryption. So while I acknowledge that all of these other functions do exist today, I'm really talking about, when I talk about ransomware, I'm talking about the encryption portion. Right? And I focus on ransomware because it is a really good illustration of how different cyber operations rely on different coercive logics and should not be treated as monolithic. And so to explore this, I go back to the classics in our discipline. There's a famous scholar named Tom Schelling, very famous in our discipline, maybe not so much in others. But Tom Schelling was a famous scholar who wrote a lot about nuclear deterrence theory. And in his books, he actually talks about two different ways you can structure coercion. All right, so the first one is the one we're more familiar with, right? So by using the power to hurt held in reserve, I have a big stick, I am prepared to use it anytime, but I'm refraining from using it, and displaying that I have a big stick will hopefully compel you in X, Y, and Z ways. And we're more familiar with this way to think about coercion in IR, at least in IR, because its chief application to nuclear strategy and a lot of coercion theory in our discipline developed hand in hand with developments in nuclear technology as a weapon. The second logic is the one we're less familiar with, but it's actually also a pretty common tactic, right? By hurting someone up front and then offering to stop if they give in to the demand. So I have a big stick and I start hitting you first, and then I offer to stop hitting you once you meet my demand, right? And so when we think about things like sanctions, hostage taking, blockades, siege of a castle, for example, we can actually see that this way of structuring a coercive threat is also not uncommon throughout history. And so throughout this talk, I refer to the first logic as coercion relying on ex post punishment, and the second logic as coercion relying on ex ante denial. And the reason why I say that these two have different coercive logics is that they each have different credibility challenges to solve. And so this is not just a matter of a difference in when the timing of the costs are applied. Right? And so let me actually go into what kind of different credibility challenges there are in these two categories of coercive logics. So for a threat that relies on ex post punishment, whether it's using cyber weapons or some other conventional weapon, the attacker needs to solve two challenges at the same time. So you can think about the orange shaded area at the top as a portion where the costs need to be applied, and as the gray striped region as a portion where the costs need to be withheld. And so the first challenge for the attacker in this kind of a coercive structure is making the defender believe that the attacker will hurt if and only if the defender refuses. And the second challenge is that the attacker will not hurt if and only if the defender gives in. And even outside of the context of cyber operations, solving both of these challenges at the same time is quite difficult. Right? So having a big army may solve the first problem, but you need additional measures, to tie your hands to signal that you're ready to commit to the second problem as well. So with this in mind, right, so the cyber commitment problem, if you look at it from this perspective, is really a critique of the first challenge, that a cyber threat relying on ex post punishment in particular, such as relying on the threat of wiper malware, for example, makes it hard to credibly convey capability to hurt ex ante without actually burning the capability itself. But it's a critique mainly of the first challenge, only. So on the other hand, in coercion relying on ex ante denial, the challenge is really different. So because the costs are applied upfront, the orange bar moves upfront. So the two challenges are that first, you have to be able to promise to keep hurting as long as it's necessary until the victim gives in. I have a big stick and I can, boot you on the head for as long as possible until you give in. Second challenge is that you have to be able to promise to stop as soon as the victim gives in. And you can also see here why solving both of these at the same time will be very difficult. But it's a different set of challenges and a different set of promises that the attacker needs to be able to promise to the defender than the one relying on ex post punishment. And as long as we can identify sort of cyber capabilities that fall into the second category of threats, relying on ex ante denial, these classes of capabilities are then not subject to the cyber commitment problem, though they have these two other credibility challenges to solve. And ransomware is a really good example of one of the attacks in this second category. Right? So, and the reason why is that the capability to inflict damage is already proven, quite literally, upfront at the moment of encryption. And so this is why ransomware gangs have absolutely no problem publicly posting their ransom notes, without worrying that communicating that ransom note will somehow burn their capability to keep that data under hostage once the encryption kicks in. And so that's why this is a fundamentally different problem than the threat to unleash a wiper malware. And so therefore, in order to have a more comprehensive understanding of how coercion works and doesn't work in cyberspace, we need to do a lot more theory building in IR. And one way to to explore this is to kind of set scope conditions on a strategic problem. So, like, to which sets of phenomena is the cyber commitment problem applicable, but not for others? How can we better describe the coercive logic in each of these phenomena? And also, like, what are the more appropriate analogies we can use when comparing cyber operations to existing coercive means that we're more familiar with, at least in IR. So, some behaviors in cyberspace are more analogous to coercion using nuclear weapons, while others are more, analogous to things like blockades or sieges. And so, what I'm doing today is to pick one of these and then expand on its own coercive logic in more detail to eventually contribute to, the broader theory building efforts of the larger discipline. Yes. Yeah.
So the cyber commitment problem is mostly related to ex post punishment, right?
Yes.
Even though the examples you give here show that it's possible to conduct ex post punishment with cyber capabilities, right?
Yeah, so I actually think that the cyber commitment problem itself has, like, the situations under which that problem is severe versus not severe actually varies a lot. Yeah. And I explored that in a separate paper. And I think the problem itself is thought to be very sort of static and always thought of as very severe. But we can think about all sorts of examples of where like a vulnerability is discovered and made public, but it takes like 2 years to patch and mitigate the vulnerability, like Log4j and things like that. Depends if you're a large, complex organization, makes it much harder to push through these patches, whereas if you're trying to fix one workstation, that would be a problem. And so there are all sorts of different things that sort of complicate the problem from the countermeasure side, but also, there might be ways to signal that you have a general capability without showing that you have a specific intrusion into one particular system, and maybe that general credibility is enough, right? So we can think about all sorts of ways in which even under this category, it's possible to do coercion. All right, so let me now transition into the formal model side of things, and numbers are going to start popping out. So I'm going to be, I'm going to try to be extra careful walking through the slides in this section. So before I get into the weeds, I want to just provide the main intuition of my argument up front to help you get the main gist. And it's always sort of difficult to present equations in a short amount of time in a social science, discipline where people are not used to it. So, like the first set of things I want to convey is it's analytically useful to think about the suffering caused by encryption as basically two different variables, right? So first, there is the lump sum cost of having to potentially seek recovery without getting a decryption key. This is going to be your outside option, right? This involves hiring consultants, buying new hardware, trying to do like piecemeal data recovery from any sort of offline backups that you had if you're lucky, right? So how costly is my outside option as a lump sum? And I refer to that as alpha throughout the equation. The second set of costs that you can think about is what is the total flow cost suffered each day as a result of my critical systems being encrypted and therefore unavailable for my daily use, right? So if I'm a business, what is my daily loss of revenue from having my systems encrypted and therefore I'm not able to, make sales, ship, whatever products, and how long is that suffering expected to last? And so I refer to that as beta. And the combination of these two costs basically determine how much the attacker can demand from the victim in equilibrium. And thinking about these two parameters separately instead of a single parameter matters for thinking about some of my extensions, which I don't think I'll have time to walk you through today, but I can share you some intuitions and initial hypotheses. The second thing is we can think about a little bit about how attacker strategies diverge between spray and pray tactics, like these long, wide span sort of campaigns. But each one of the victims, are not worth that much, sort of in equilibrium. But also big game hunting, in which you do a lot of reconnaissance to focus on one specific target. But once you're successful, you can ask for a lot more money per head. And so while the credibility challenges associated with ex-ante denial cannot be completely solved in a coercion using ransomware, there are certain features of ransomware that we can think about that can be helpful in helping solve these two challenges, right? So first is reversibility. If I can reverse some of the suffering caused by being able to reverse the effects. If I can encrypt data and hold it hostage, but be able to return that data back to the victim, you can increase the sort of the average ransom demanded by the amount that you can promise to return, instead of destroying your asset piecemeal as part of your coercive code. The second thing that ransomware provides an edge in solving these credibility challenges is the ability to fully commit to continue to hurt when you're applying costs, right? So if you think about, for example, a siege or a blockade, right? Every day that a medieval army is laying a siege, it costs the attacker as it costs the defender at the same time. We need to feed the army, they need to have some sort of costly decision where feudal lords have to be gathered, right? So all of that is a cost to the attacker. And if it's a cost to the attacker, it faces a commitment problem for laying the siege as long as possible until the defender gives in. Encryption doesn't really have that dynamic in which once the encryption kicks in, it doesn't really cost anything to the attacker to keep that encryption going. And so that resolves a key commitment problem in committing to continue to hurt as long as necessary. Right, so I present a simple model of ransomware that serves as a baseline for then exploring several extensions that branch out of it. And so the baseline model I can walk you through. The extensions, I'll just convey the intuition. So there are two players, an attacker and a defender. And there are three stages to this game. So in the first stage, the attacker and defender makes a simultaneous decision. And what I mean by that is each side makes a decision without knowing what the other side chose. The defender makes a binary decision on whether to defend or not. And if it chooses to defend, it costs some fixed cost COD to buy some bundle of defense that is 100% effective at blocking the attack. This is a gross simplification of choosing among a continuous choice of defense bundles, right? So you're either, the simplification comes in because you're either going to buy just enough defense to thwart off an attack or not spend money at all in equilibrium. And so of course, there are more complex ways to model this, the cost portion of this, but for now we're leaving this choice as it is, but we can always make it continuous and also make it endogenous. Similarly, the attacker chooses whether to attack or not, and if it chooses to attack, it spends some fixed cost COA. So this is all the time you're spending doing initial reconnaissance. Maybe you need to buy some tools to do the initial intrusion, or all the subscriptions you're buying to study security companies' detection systems. So it costs the attacker as much as it costs the defender as well. And so, because these are both binary choices, there are 4 possible outcomes. And so if you're in the box of, the attacker chose to attack and the defender chose not to defend, then, the attacker can move to the next stage because the attack is successful. So the attacker goes ahead, encrypts the victim systems, and demands some ransom demand denoted as X. And so in the third stage, the defender decides whether to acquiesce or to resist the demand. So if you acquiesce, the defender just transfers X over to the attacker, and so the payoff is minus X. If you resist, the defender's payoff is then this outside option. You pay the alpha, and then you pay the beta. Right? It's the suffering you're expected to suffer until some fixed, future date in which you can have access to some new hardware or data recovery. Right? And so this way of modeling beta is also, side note is that it's also a simplification of otherwise what is like an infinite horizon model, because in reality you don't know when you're going to have the option to go the outside option route. But that is turned into a fixed horizon model by just simplifying the payoff as beta, by assuming that there is some future period in which the victim will just pay the lump sum cost of alpha to just replace the systems without seeking a recovery, so that you're not infinitely held hostage for this. Right? So that assumption turns it into a finite horizon model and collapses this payoff so that we can make the calculations much more simple. Right? And so I solved this model by simple background induction. So a little, before I do the background induction, sort of a side note on what alpha and beta means in real life. So these are sort of 4 different categories of victims that I think of when I think about alpha and beta. Right? So someone with a very low alpha, but also very low beta might be, like an undergrad student or a grad student whose main asset is just, a laptop, and most of the documents can be backed up on Google Drive, and, so the flow cost is not much, and also, the outside option of replacing your laptop maybe and restoring from Google Drive is not much. So low alpha, low beta. Someone with a low alpha but a high beta might be someone, the same grad student, but this is during finals week, and there is, a deadline within 24 hours. And so now the flow cost is spiked up. And so this also explains why sort of in the wild, people are targeted when it's the most important day, right? Like first day of school, during finals week, when ransomware is unleashed on the education sector. Someone with the high alpha and low beta, it's a little hard to think about in real life, but just throwing it out there as an example, is something that costs a lot to replace, but the flow cost is very little. So like think about like an automated harvesting machine, right? That gets encrypted. So this machine is probably very rare, so very hard to replace. But if you encrypt them during winter, there's nothing to harvest. The flow cost is not much. That's how you think about high alpha, low beta. A high alpha and a high beta are places like hospitals in which it's really hard to replace patient data, especially if you don't have backups. High beta because there are lives at stake beyond just property damage. All right, so going to the backward induction portion, we start at the last stage. Think about the defender's decision to acquiesce or resist, and you just simply compare the utilities between acquiescing and resisting, so you get this inequality condition. So, the ransom demanded just has to be smaller than alpha and beta. And then knowing this, the attacker just optimally maximizes this constraint and sets X star, which is the equilibrium ransom demanded. That's what the star means, as just a combination of alpha and beta. And so, having done that, we can transform this game into a 2x2 and explore this, because we can collapse alpha and beta and all of that decision down to an X star. And X star is a combination of two exogenous parameters. Okay, and so this becomes an attacker-defender game where both are making a simultaneous decision. The attacker is deciding between attack or not attack. Defender is choosing between defend or not defend. And as you can see, there are no pure strategy equilibria in this game. So both of them will have to mix their strategy and randomize between attacking and not attacking and defending, not defending. So we'll get probabilities in the end rather than pure strategies. And so we solve the game. We solve for P, which is the probability that the attacker will choose attack, and Q star will be the probability that the defender will choose defend. And so let me unpack what these comparative statics mean in the next slide. And so before I do that, a useful note sort of on how to interpret these probabilities, right? So is to think about the Hastani purification theorem when it comes to thinking about mixed strategy equilibria, right? So like a mixed strategy equilibria can be explained sort of as a limit of pure strategy equilibria, in which like it's an incomplete information, Bayesian Nash. And it's a slightly perturbed game in which these payoffs are private information, and there's an epsilon tucked at the end, and that becomes sort of a game of pure strategies with incomplete information. But as the epsilon heads to 0, that's when the solution resembles more and more like a mixed strategy. So that's another way to think about, okay, how like attackers are not actually flipping coins, but that's how you can think about the P star and the Q star as basically pure strategies in the limit. Okay, so what the comparative statics means in words is that sort of all else equal, so you're more likely to defend, so that means Q is increasing, as the expected suffering becomes greater, right? So as alpha and beta becomes greater, and you're also less likely to defend as the cost of attack becomes higher. So as the cost of attack becomes higher, they're less likely to invest in going out and looking for victims, and knowing that you're less likely to buy that bundle of defense. And so equation 2 is saying that all else equal, you're less likely to attack as the total expected suffering of the victim becomes greater, and you're more likely to attack as the cost of defense becomes higher. So all of the comparative statics are relatively very clear, except the last bit, right? So why would P star be decreasing instead of increasing in alpha and beta. Right? You would perhaps expect that if the prize is worth more, then the attackers would attack more. Right? And so the reason why we get this result is that as alpha and beta increases, so the more and more you resemble a hospital more than a grad student, defenders also defend with higher probability, at least in the model. Right? So if you have more to protect, you are more likely to buy that bundle of defense, which means that the probability an attack will succeed also decreases because the wall becomes higher and higher. And so if you think about the Hassani purification theorem in this context, right, so only really high types of attackers who are capable of jumping over very high walls will be able to get to this victim, while all of the other types won't be able to get over this high wall that is purchased by the defense model. And that's why you see this comparative setting, and that's how we can kind of think about interpreting. And we also see some of this pattern in how ransomware games operate, and this is where the divergence of strategy comes in. Right? So either you spray and pray, you mass target victims with low alpha and beta, which are really easy challenges. The wall is very low, but they're also worth very little. So you ask for $500, or you do big game hunting. Right? So you carefully select a few victims with very high alpha and beta, which are really hard to compromise, at least in theory, but it should be worth more once you get in, and you can demand a very high X star. Right, and so going to briefly walk over some of the extensions and how I'm thinking about ways of relaxing some of the assumptions in the baseline model. So one extension I explore is how reversibility, which is something I explained earlier as one of the benefits of using encryption as a coercive tool as opposed to sieges or blockades, is the ability to return portions of the asset back to the victim instead of destroying it forever, right? So if you think about a bombing campaign, you're destroying apartment buildings one at a time, and every apartment building destroyed is a sunk cost, and it's not something that can be promised back to the defender once they give in to your coercive demand. And so the ability to give something back to the victim can increase the equilibrium ransom demanded because you can extract that much more. Another extension has to do with the ability to credibly commit to keep hurting as long as the victim does not give in. The other good thing about using encryption. And so, laying a siege, blockade are costly to the attacker as it is costly to the defender, right? This makes it difficult for the attacker to indefinitely commit to applying flow costs. And so, So I explore an extension in which I compare ransomware to sieges and blockades and explore how the inability to fully commit to keep hurting affects basically beta, which is the flow cost, and therefore affects the equilibrium ransom. Finally, we can talk about relaxing the assumption in the baseline model where as soon as the X star is paid, the decryption key is given, and we're all happy and the game just ends. In reality, that is not how attackers always behave. And so sometimes even when you pay the ransom, you don't get your decryption key. And sometimes even when you pay the ransom, the attackers just come back next week, encrypt the same system again, and ask for the same sort of ransom again. And so I explored two different extensions where there is a certain bad apple in the distribution of attacker types where they just don't like to give decryption keys back, and the defender has to guess the probability in which the particular attacker that I'm facing is one of those bad apples. And the second extension is, what do I do when this is turned into a repeated game in which I have to think about my reputation and if I pay the ransom, that is revealing my willingness to pay and branding me as a certain type in which I'm more likely to pay than the next victim that's going to come along, which may affect the probability that the attacker will come back the next day and ask for the same ransom. And so that is going to make me less likely to pay today because I have this future in mind. Right. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the implications, and being sort of from a social science discipline, the first thing I think of is, what does this all mean for our discipline and cyber coercion theory and international relations? So far, IR scholars say that cyber capabilities are going to be really poor tools of coercion, and there seems to be a lot of consensus on this for some reason, right? Despite some of the empirical literature that have been very successful cases of cyber coercion, right? So there are these theories, cyber commitment problems, other theories saying that, well, cyber capabilities are going to be more useful as side tools to conventional operations, but not going to have coercive power on their own. There are also limited empirical studies showing that cyber attacks in the context of an ongoing armed conflict has had little coercive effect on the battlefield. And so, there are some literature out there, and their collective consensus is that cyber tools are not going to be good for coercion, and therefore we shouldn't really worry about their malicious use. So ransomware, demonstrates that there are important exceptions to these pre-existing explanations of cyber coercion. And so rather than trying to find some universal or axiomatic conditions of the cyber domain, well, cyber is X, cyber is Y, and try to come up with some universal theory on cyberspace as a whole, there is utility to disaggregating what it means to conduct a cyber operation. And the other thing is that, what this means for coercion theory in general. So coercion generally has a low success rate across the board, whether it's cyber or whether it's some other tool, right? So like, empirical studies of how nuclear weapons can be used coercively, the studies have found that only 20% of them have been successful at coercing victims into making political concessions. Economic sanctions, there are many studies on economic sanctions, but usually they float around like 25% to 35%. They're somewhat effective, but not too effective, right? So, but it's kind of interpreting it as whether you see it as half full or half empty kind of a situation, right? So, the goal is, anyone who's trying these, coercive tools, are not thinking that they're going to be successful 100%. That's not why they are attempting these coercive attempts. They're attempting this because, the alternative of using these tools is to do nothing. And if you don't do anything, with a 100% probability, you get 0. And so, they're thinking, if I have some at least some chance of success, and the consequences of it aren't going to be that big, why not just try and attempt these? And so, 100% is not what we're aiming for here. And so, the empirical evidence is still limited, but we're starting to see some examples here and there in which nation states and non-state actors are trying to use cyber operations in order to get political concessions, not just bitcoins from their victims, right? So this is a recent example of Iran hacking Charlie Hebdo, which is a satirical magazine, and they recently announced a cartoon competition in which people can make submissions of cartoons basically mocking Mohammed. And so Iran got really angry at this call and decided to hack Charlie Hebdo, stole all of their customer database, and is now holding it hostage, and they're threatening to release it publicly. And releasing of this information publicly can hurt the subscriber because they might be targets for hate crime. Second is the movie The Interview, and how the North Koreans hacked into Sony, wiped a bunch of their workstations, but also exfiltrated a bunch of unreleased movies and whatnot to basically get Sony to drop release of the movie The Interview. So it's, their coercive success is really a mixed bag, right? So their initial goal of keeping this movie from being shown to the outside world has failed. I think more people saw this movie because of this incident actually than otherwise. It's really not the most Oscar-worthy movie, in my opinion. But because of this incident, they were able to generate some sort of capability that North Korea's cyber capabilities is not to be underestimated, and it did have an impact in making subsequent movie makers and show makers think twice about making a show about the North Korean regime. We can talk about different examples of other movies that got shut down as a result of the movie. Finally, there's a specific use of the use of ransomware for political concessions, in which at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict last year, a group of hacktivists in Belarus encrypted a bunch of portions of the Belarusian railway, and then posted this message on Twitter saying, well, we'll decrypt the railway if you meet these demands. So I think the first demand is, something that the Belarusian government could have given into, but, asking for a wholesale change of its Russia policy was probably too big of an X-star to demand. So in the end, it wasn't really successful at compelling these political concessions, but we're starting to see these examples where ransomware is being used in a political context, not just to ask for bitcoins for cybercrime, but in a very geopolitical context. And finally, I have some slides on why we see some discrepancies in which we see so much ransomware in the private sector, but not so much in the other sort of in this geostrategic context. But in the interest of time, maybe I'll talk about all this during Q&A. I'm going to end with one example, which I think is especially relevant. So Iran unleashed a bunch of cyber attacks. So some of them was ransomware, some of them was wiper, some of them was hack and leak. It was a combination of all three against Albania last year. And why Albania? Because Albania is hosting a bunch of anti-Iranian sort of opposition groups, is providing a safe haven for them. So in order to get Albania to stop providing safe havens, Iran attacked the Albanian sort of government and explicitly asked that they stop providing conference venues and all these safe havens for these opposition groups to hold their conferences. And so, the actual conference ended up getting canceled, and Albania, cut diplomatic relations with Iran. So, I think this is a very good example that's showing that, cyber coercion is, being attempted very much in real life by nation states, especially countries like Iran, North Korea, and that we should not be underestimating the coercive power of cyber operations, and our continuing to do so may lead us to a strategic surprise for in a future crisis, for example, between a crisis between China and Taiwan, right? And so in order to avoid that strategic surprise, we need to do a lot more thinking about the coercive use of cyber operations. Thanks for your time. I'm now ready for your questions.
I'll start with one question from online. So to what extent have you found that there's an influence on the attacker's charge demand based on institution or public policy, like saying we'll never pay the ransom, or trying to encourage the victim to pay anyway, or that the attacker might then try to take the price down to encourage the victim to pay, or something like that?
Yeah, so on the last one, I think we see that all the time, right? There is usually like a customer service hotline between the ransomware attackers and the victims, and usually the insurance company will step in and act as sort of de facto negotiators, and they'll cut down on the demand. Usually it's negotiable. In terms of the sort of the government policy of you should never pay ransom, we're putting our foot down. I can see why the government would have that approach, But at the same time, a lot of that is probably not incentive compatible with the actual victim. If you're the victim, you always want to pay, given that the ransom was structured low enough. So I think the government's challenge is to then say, well, let me subsidize this outside option for you, make it cheaper for you to seek data recovery without getting a decryption key, so as to incentivize you further to actually not pay ransom, instead of just having like a blanket policy of never pay ransom.
Thanks.
Should we take more online or?
That was the primary question online. Although, I mean, the other question from, also from Sean was, you know, how might this change if we shift from a rational decision framework to some like more realistic, but more behavioral sort of framework? Yeah.
Is there any context as to what kind of?
Yeah, no, it would be interesting to hear how this may change if we shift from the rational decisions this strategy seem to rely upon. Like, is there a, so I'll try to interpret, since he unfortunately had to leave, so he'll get this on the recording. But just kind of, are there places where that equilibrium is going to break down because of some like lack of information on one side or the other, or you know, human decision strategy where the person is going to, where like overrate, I don't know, overrate current discomfort and underrate future discomfort or something like that, right? If there are places where those known irregularities are going to change how that's going to come out.
Yeah. So I think information problems are, you know, a totally fair way to kind of think about extensions to the model. But having information problems are not necessarily related to like you can still think about information problems under the wide structure of game theory without necessarily getting rid of it altogether and just relying on behavioral sort of approaches. And so, but you know, the inability to maybe guess your payoffs, the inability to see far into the future, the inability to know exactly what your defense bundle need to be, you know, all of those are perfectly fine, you know, assumptions to relax. And I think obviously if you don't know what these payoffs are, they're gonna affect your ability to pay. But if you are a rational actor, you might have an interest in conveying or doing research into finding out these payoffs. So all of that is just kind of assumed in the model.
So your data scientist for your ransomware gang needs to go in and see where the
yeah, and ransomware attackers actually do a lot of reconnaissance work to guess what the victim's alpha and beta is exactly before suggesting a demand. They will like look into like company revenues and look into their EBITDAs and all of these things before suggesting putting the price out.
I wasn't actually being sarcastic about the ransomware gang's data scientists.
Absolutely.
Like,
I think they're absolutely doing
data scientists. And it's a business.
Jenny, aren't you assuming that encryption completely removes the threat? Because we know that it's not necessarily the case, right? If they have a hold on the system, even if they decrypt the information, they still have a hold on my system. They can encrypt it in the future.
Yeah. So I think that's a major commitment problem actually. So in this model, that commitment problem is not explored, right? Once I give my decryption key, the game ends and you know the victim is happy again. In reality, you know, there are several situations where that might not happen. So one of, you know, there was like extension 3 at the end where like all of that can go wrong, right? So one of them is, you know, I can never, maybe I won't give you back my decryption key. One of them is I can come back the second day if, you know, I can, you know, do an RDP port scan again, and if they haven't closed their hole, you know, I can, you know, get in the same way that I got in last week. The third problem is if, you know, I give you the decryption key, but I don't tell you exactly how I got in, and therefore all of that vector is still exposed, then, you know, what what other kinds of promises can the attacker make such that, okay, once you pay this lump sum, you're set. Right? Like, you don't have to worry about me coming back the next day and encrypting your thing. So, like, I don't know if this happens in real life, but if I were to be like a very smart ransomware attacker, I would provide that information. I would act as the incident response security professional on top of the person, giving the decryption key back and saying, this is exactly how I got in. This is where I gained my foothold.
Yeah.
This is how I, gained admin privileges to encrypt your entire network. And so I'm telling you all of this so that you can close these holes as a way to convey my type as a good robber rather than a bad robber. I don't know if this actually happens, but if they take game theory, maybe they will understand that this is what they also need to do. Because unless I have that assurance, maybe I don't want to pay you in the first place.
I wonder if insurance companies will be interested in that because they are dealing with ransomware dilemmas consistently.
Yeah. And I think with insurance, I think the recent problem is that they stopped covering because they just get flooded with these and the payout is so great. And the refusal to cover is not good for the ecosystems. I think insurance companies should actually cover the outside option, the data recovery and the incident response rather than the ransom amount. I think covering the ransom amount actually encourages victims to just pay.
Fascinating.
I'm curious how ransomware is usually thought of in the context of your discipline outside of political science. Is it mainly considered as like a technical problem to solve?
Good question. So we speak about ransomware in my class on Foundations of Cybersecurity, and I view this as really, following this work as a game changer for cyber escalation because all of those special characteristics that you listed so nicely. So this is something that we need to further technically understand, not only what was encrypted, but how actually hackers got in, and do we have any assurance that it's not going to happen again? But this is viewed as a demonstration of yet another level of attacks. That's why it's so popular and continuing to gain popularity over the years. I think, thinking about types of attacks, this is maybe the most popular one.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I heard some statistics somewhere that more than half of all UK emergency covert meetings are now on ransomware.
Wow.
Yeah, not even like more than half of all cyber-related incidents. More than half of all national emergency meetings are now on ransomware.
Yeah, everything is a target.
Well, it's so economically attractive to do it that way because people have incentive to pay because it's their own data and because of like you said, the suffering that they're going through and not having access. And then so there's a whole ecosystem and business model that's built up around it to try to extract more value from the victims or up to the idea of ransomware as a service, right? Where you've got the ability you can just go to and say, I would like to ransomware these people now, please. And just kind of, like it's kind of a perfect storm almost. Like people hit on this almost not perfect crime, but kind of this situation where you don't have to worry about getting credit cards. You don't have to worry about, wow, do I sell this data because you're selling it back to the person you stole it from. So there's no, it's really simple. And it's really, there's a certain amount of like, psychologically you have to do something about it. Like it's your stuff. There's a whole set of things around that as well.
What I thought was interesting in connection to your lecture actually last month was how so many of these local and state governments
Yeah.
have these like public-facing vulnerabilities, and there's so many, and there's no effort to kind of mitigate them, right? And one of them at the high end of your graph was Baltimore, and Baltimore got hit by ransomware a couple of years ago, really big, and yet they still have all these vulnerabilities, you know, wide open, and
Yeah.
so.
That's unbelievable. But I think from a policy side of things, it really quickly exposes your weak link in cyberspace. Like, who are the weak players? Cities, local governments,
Municipal.
local hospitals, municipals. Yeah, this is where ransomware hits hard. So it really shows you that maybe regulation is pretty lax right now. Implementation is very hard, and ransomware really shows you how things can get worse quickly.
Yeah.
So.
In the new national cybersecurity strategy that got released like 2 weeks ago, I think there was a lot of talk on ransomware, which was like a very big development from the strategy 4 or 5 years ago. And I think because coming up with regulations on these individual sectors, especially at the state and local level where the federal government may not have jurisdiction, because of those challenges, I think the government is shifting towards a strategy where they're just going after ransomware gangs. And we'll just hack back and steal decryption keys and we'll inoculate those mass. So we'll probably see more of that one person action going forward.
Because they gave up.
Yeah, they're like, okay, we're gonna just stop trying to inoculate these victims. We're just gonna go to the source, hack them back, steal their resources, or freeze their crypto wallets so that like they can't do anything with it.
Who are those groups, Jenny, from your experience? I know we have some.
There are several, right? So there's like Rebel, which is the big one, Conti, which is the big one, BitLocker. And then they get shut down, but like, you know, they're big organizations, so other members just disband and they join a different group, and they come back with a different variant.
Do we know who is behind this? Is it a nation-state initiative? Is it?
So, from what I know, they're mainly non-state, but they operate mostly in Eastern Europe, and they have at least an implicit understanding, maybe even an explicit understanding with the Russian government that they will not explicitly target any victims in Russia, and Russia, you know, does not, you know, actively track that on them. And as long as, you know, they have Western organizations that wreak havoc and disrupt, you know, their daily life, you know, the Russian government is happy. And so I don't know how much of this relationship is explicit. It's at least implicit in that if you look at some of like, I think it was DarkSide or Rebel, you know, if you look at some of their code base, they will explicitly avoid encrypting systems that use Russian or Russian-related languages as one of their keywords. So that's a way to kind of, you know, work around.
So we just all need to enable Russian keyboards on our.
Yeah, that's the solution.
Make
Like
sure.
everyone have download Russian and Credo language keyboards.
Start taking Russian on Duolingo and
Yeah,
then download
yeah.
the keyboard and make sure that you're.
Basically, yeah. But like nation states will directly use ransomware too. Like Iran use their own variant. Especially ransomware used like wipers in the context of like their shadow conflict with Israel. I think like all throughout like 2021, 2022. Like North Korea will use ransomware. They have their own variant. But it's mainly for cybercrime. It's just one of the tools and many of their ways to generate foreign cash.
Well, I don't want to cut the conversation short, but we've run a little past, and I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to go if they want, and that our recording isn't 6 hours long. But go ahead and stop the webinar, and then we can maybe keep talking, but just sort of do that maybe. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you for coming.